This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. In late August, President Biden issued an executive order to forgive as much as $500 billion in student debt. The president characterized the act as relief for, quote, those who need it most, unquote, despite the fact that the 42% of Americans with college degrees enjoy a substantially lower rate of unemployment and can expect, on average, an additional $1 million in lifetime earnings. While critics characterize the move as a gift from poorer Americans to the wealthy college graduates, defenders of debt cancellation contend that the debt was an overwhelming burden that threatened to stifle borrowers' family formation and life ambitions. Are taxpayers owed an explanation as to why student debt should be forgiven? And before spending more than the Wall Street bailout that followed the global financial crisis, shouldn't the president explain the cause for the chasm that seems to lie between the cost of a college degree and the benefit that leaves graduates without the ability to pay it back? My guest today is Dr. Beth Akers, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on the economics of higher education. Dr. Akers has researched the incentives leading to both the trend towards greater student indebtedness and the lack of accountability for institutions of higher education that facilitate public student borrowing. She will share with us her perspective on the president's executive order, including who benefits, who pays, and what are the likely effects on future student debt and college tuitions. When I return, I'll be joined by AEI Senior Fellow, Dr. Beth Akers. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by American Enterprise Institute Senior Fellow, Beth Akers. Welcome back to Hubwonk, Beth.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Wonderful. Well, I thought to reach out to you. You had a wonderful article in the Boston Globe and some other places discussing the most recent executive action by President Biden to forgive student debt. We're going to get into the details of that. I'm talking to you from Boston. It's the first week in September, so we're buzzing. There's lots of students here. Perhaps they're all excited about this debt forgiveness, but I want to take a deeper look and find out what it means for the rest of us. So let's start at the beginning. You wrote a piece in the Globe talking about the details, but I want to go deep. What exactly has happened? What did the president do, and who is going to benefit from this executive action?
Okay, great. So officially, nothing has happened quite yet, but we have a promise from the White House to really do two main things. One is what we've all been talking about. It's that we're forgiving between $10,000 and $20,000 in student debt for people who are below income caps, depending on whether or not they received a Pell Grant, which tells us if their family was pretty well off or not well off when they went to college. So that's the piece that we've been buzzing about. The other piece that we've talked less about in the popular media is that at the same time, the president has proposed that we'll make it much cheaper for students to repay their loans. What a lot of people don't realize is that we already have repayment programs for federal student loans that cancel loans for students if they prove to be unaffordable over a long period of time. So what that means is that a borrower pays back an amount that's affordable based on their monthly income. And then at either 10 or 20 years for most people, we would just forgive whatever was left. Now, the president accelerated that by reducing the share of income that needs to be paid on a monthly basis and making it so that debts are all forgiven after that 10-year period. So, we're all upset about the loan cancellation. This is probably the much more consequential piece of the policy change.
I see. So one is sort of a one-off, 10,000, boom, it's wiped out if you debt of traditional, I guess we're going to get into this, public loan, and for Pell Grants, it's $20,000.
Right.
Before we get into more of that, what are the estimates? You put two buckets. One is the $10,000 and $20,000 forgiveness, and the other is the acceleration of the payments. Do we have an estimate of how much money that will cost the federal government? And because the federal government doesn't have its own money, how much will it cost all of us?
Yeah, so the best estimates for the cost of the cancellation piece is about $500 billion. But to be honest, I'm not putting stock in any single number. we don't really have a good sense of who's going to apply and get this benefit, or how wide reaching it's going to be. Researchers just don't have the data to know who's going to benefit. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what that total price tag is going to be. Other than that, it's going to be huge. That is certain. The other piece of it, we don't quite know yet. And that's much more difficult to estimate, but certainly increasing the current costs of that program by a very wide margin.
So that's a big number, even if we can't hang our hat on precisely $500 billion.
Yeah.
The Wall Street bailout in 2008. And we're still talking about that more than a decade later, about what a boondoggle that was, perhaps. This is of that size and magnitude. So
it was of that size. And remember, that was money that got paid back, right? Through the TARP program. This is money that's going out the door and never coming back.
So let's talk about it's going out the door. Clearly, people who have student debt have gone to college, at least some college. What percentage of people go to college? And I'm going to slip in another question. Are these debts just something at their local bank, or are these particular student debts, that is public student debts versus, let's say, if we went to the bank and borrowed money on our own?
Great. Yeah. So the vast majority of outstanding student debt in the economy is federal student loans. And so the president's executive action only addresses loans that were taken through the federal student loan program, which is like more than 90% of the debt. People sometimes take private loans, most often for graduate school, and sometimes for undergraduate, if the maximums that they're allowed to borrow from the government aren't enough. But that's a small share that's left untouched here. So we're only talking about the federal program. And so this isn't imposing a cost on banks or, the financial markets in any way. This is all just a federal program. And a lot of students are taking, I can't remember the share of students who are taking debt, but we've seen it steadily increasing over time. And the ability to finance higher education out of savings or by working your way through college, it's just no longer existent for most families. So financing through federal loans has kind of become the de facto way of paying for college in the United States.
Now, the president has characterized this debt as enormous and crushing, and really made it sound as if people really can't start their lives. They graduate college, they've got this huge millstone around their neck. They can't, they can't buy houses, they can't start their lives. It's this debt is prohibitive. In our earlier conversation, our earlier episode, you characterized how much debt the average student has and where the small amounts and the big amounts. Let's start broadly. What does the average student graduate with an undergrad, a BS? How much debt do they have?
A typical student leaving a bachelor's degree will have about $30,000 in debt. And that is because that is essentially where the limit is on federal student borrowing.
I see. But there are those who have a much larger debt. What are those who have, let's say, $100,000 debt? What would characterize that kind of a student?
So students with those six-figure debts that are often portrayed in popular media characterizations of the issue, those are people who borrowed for graduate school. So unlike undergraduate borrowing, which has these pretty reasonable limits, right? $30,000 for a degree that on average pays $1 million of extra earnings. That seems like a fair trade, right? For graduate school, students are able to borrow largely without limit. And so that's where you get those really large balances that, surprisingly though, these aren't the ones statistically that people have the most trouble paying back. In fact, it's the very low balance borrowers who struggle the most. The reason is because those are people often who started college and didn't finish.
I see. So I don't want to go too far down this hole, but I just want to say the president talked about these as the people who are most in need, ironically, college graduates who are most in need. It seems odd to me relative to those who don't go to college. Naturally, if you don't go to college, you don't have college debt. If you do, you may. What is the benefit? I'm sure you've studied this. What is the lifetime benefit of a college degree in terms of earnings, and what are the relative, let's say, unemployment rates? I don't know if you have that number, those numbers at your fingertips, but someone must be measuring that.
Well, I really take issue with the fact that, policymakers are characterizing people with student debt as the neediest in the economy. Not everybody who goes to college is getting a great deal, right? We know that because we read the New York Times reports about people who are working as baristas with $100,000 in debt, right? So we know those cases exist of people who really are struggling. But the averages tell a different story. And the average is what's the typical experience. Georgetown University has a program that studied the returns of education very intensely. Their estimates indicate that someone with a bachelor's degree will earn an extra $1 million over the course of their career relative to someone with just a high school diploma. So taking out $30,000 in debt gets you $1 million bump in earnings over your lifetime. Seems like a pretty good deal. And in fact, it's for the most part, a wealth enhancing activity to go to college, even if you have to borrow to get through. And yes, we know that college educated workers have lower rates of unemployment than less educated workers. Sort of funny almost to think about the fact that we put these student loans repayment on pause throughout the COVID economic downturn, and even till just recently until the president promised to have those loans go back into repayment at the end of the year. But college educated workers were the ones who largely kept their jobs during the recent maybe recession. And that's generally the case, that these workers have much more robust jobs and attachment to the workforce.
Indeed, I hadn't thought about that angle, but I guess the justification, and we can talk about that now. The legal justification, if there is one, was presumably there was an extraordinary event. I guess it was the COVID pandemic that caused an emergency. Those people with college degrees, many of them are commuting from Zoom, whereas their counterparts didn't go to college, who maybe borrowed money to buy a truck or a van or to start an apprenticeship as a plumber or whatever they happen to have. Those people had to go to work or couldn't go to work. They were most impacted. College graduates were, in many cases, unscathed or perhaps did better. And yet this is sort of the justification for this forgiveness. Do I have that right? Or am I missing something?
Well, I think that's the legal justification. So there's the political angle. I think that Democrats largely feel like people who participated in federal student lending are victims in some sense. That seems to be a separate argument from what they're using as the legal justification for this executive action. So yes, if you look at, why can the White House do this? Why does President Biden have the authority to cancel student loans? They're leaning on some authority that was given to use in times of emergency. And so I think they are ascribing the current moment to an emergency that was caused by COVID. In reality, I don't think anybody really believes that to be true, but that is the legal basis for this intervention.
Indeed, the pandemic seems to have hit the college graduates least hard, and yet they're the ones that are getting this money. I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea that, again, the narrative that college graduates are victims of something. I think I may actually agree with this point, because I think, let's imagine we were to take out money to buy a house. We have a $500,000 house, we have a $500,000 mortgage, let's assume 100% mortgage. We're essentially trading the debt for a house that we value more than the debt. And if we default, the bank takes the house back. So assuming that a college degree is worth something, we borrow money, we buy it, and then we have it. And it, as you say, generates $1 million worth of lifetime income. If indeed it doesn't, meaning these people are indeed victims and they've been sold an education that is either worth less than they paid for it or indeed genuinely worthless, isn't that the bigger problem? And isn't that essentially almost like predatory loan giving?
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to me, it seems like everyone is admitting that a college education isn't worth what you pay for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't need relief.
Yeah, so great point. So in normal consumer credit markets, there's a process called underwriting that happens. Underwriting basically means that before you give anybody a loan, you look into their circumstances and you say, does this seem like a loan that you'll be able to pay back to me? We have no underwriting in the federal student loan program. So if that sort of lending were happening in the private market, absolutely, we would say these are predatory loans. We're handing out loans to people that data tells us that they'll probably never be able to repay. Yet we do that semester after semester in higher education. And the idea is that we don't want to constrain access. We want everybody to be able to go to college. I love that idea. I wish everybody could go to college. But if we're going to put it on the individuals to pay for it themselves, we're not doing anyone any favors when we give them loans that are unaffordable. So I think it's absolutely fair to say that some of the lending that takes place through the federal loan program is predatory. Now, again, I want to emphasize, on average, people are doing great with these loans. They're low interest loans to invest in something that historically has given a great return because of the employment opportunities that it creates. But there are many instances where we almost know full well before the loan is made that that borrower will never be able to pay back. And yet, semester after semester, loans are given out like that.
Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but again, we were talking about two groups of people in the United States, those with college degrees and those without. And we've already established the earning potential is higher for the graduates that, in general than those without. Are there income caps within this? In other words, if I do go to a good school, get a great degree, and make lots and lots of money, and yet I hold debt because, well, it's a subsidized interest rate. It's a lower interest rate. So yeah, you know, a wise person would perhaps leave that debt alone and borrow, keep it as long as he wants. Is there an income limit, or is this indeed just a handout to relatively wealthy people?
Well, the income limit from the executive action was individuals earning under $125,000 a year and couples earning up to $250,000 a year. So for context, those are 2 and 3 times the median household income in the United States. So these are not particularly aggressive limits. If you think of a household earning $249,000 a year, I tend not to characterize them in my mind as being particularly needy, though of course, if someone would argue in New York City, that's not a great standard of living. But I really believe that the administration, in putting those income limits in place, was responding to criticisms from the right before this policy, was announced, which was that this is a hugely regressive intervention, that when you give money to cancel student debt, especially for graduates, you're giving a lot of money to people who are at the upper end of the income distribution and totally ignoring the bottom, which is people who didn't go to college at all and didn't borrow, or people who started college and didn't finish, right? So I think of there as being 3 groups. There's the people who never went to college. These are the lowest earners in the economy. Then there's the people who started college, didn't finish, but have some debt. This is a group I'm genuinely worried about, and I really do think they need some support. And then there's the people who took out loans and finished. So those last 2 groups are the ones that get the aid, when it should have been the first 2 that are getting economic support.
Indeed, and that sounds like it would be theoretically politically unwise. I mean, we discussed briefly whether it's legal. The question of debt forgiveness, I think it was last year, or that question was put to Nancy Pelosi. I had the quotation here. She said unequivocally, quote, "The president can't do it, so that's not even a discussion." Not everyone realizes that. She said, "But the president can only postpone, delay, but not forgive." Yeah, and yet he has, or at least plans to forgive. Is this politically, even whether you're on the left or you're the right? We talked about those who never went to college being in the minority, and if we're talking about $500 billion of expense, and we all pay taxes, that's, my back of the napkin calculation is about $3,000 per taxpayer. Everybody in the United States, whether you went to school or not, it will cost them $3,000 to give college graduates $10,000 or $20,000 or more. How is this politically wise? I mean, again, this might be outside your expertise, but it seems to me.
But I have ideas. It doesn't matter if it's outside.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, I don't know. I think a lot of people knew this was going to be unpopular before it came. The far left was really pushing for this aggressive cancellation proposal. If you look back at what Biden was saying during his campaign, he had the most modest of all the forgiveness proposals from all the Democratic candidates in the primary leading up to the 2020 election. And then some of his remarks early in his presidency, reflected his concern that a lot of the money was going to be going to graduates from these elite institutions. So, I think he was fully aware of the policy concerns. But, we also were seeing, prior to the most recent legislation passing, I think there was a real sense that Democrats had not accomplished enough with the control in DC that, they'd been holding, and that it was going to be necessary for them to check off something going into midterms that they could hang their hat on as an accomplishment. My sense was that this became that something that they felt like, maybe it was legally dubious for them to carry this out, but that they were going to give it a shot. I was hopeful when the recent legislation passed that they would abandon this effort, but it must be that the calculation is that this is beneficial to a segment of Democratic voters that they really need to turn out in midterms. And the fact that it irritates Republicans, the fact that it's not enough for, super progressives, it kind of doesn't matter, because, elections are about turnout, right? And so if it drives turnout among this group, the highly educated, mostly Democratic voter, then that may be the calculus. It's got to be, because I don't think that it was a surprise to anyone that there was sort of a backlash when this came out.
Yes, as you say, the far left, I think the signs I read as "Don't go small, cancel it all." So they're satisfied with the $20,000. They want it all. And of course, on the right, looking out for the working man. Happy. I think this is, of course, the classic case of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. We see far too often. Now, for those listeners who are like, look, the government spends money on all kinds of things I don't like, giving it to kids who went to school and, struggling to pay it back. I can still sleep at night. I don't mind it. This is not that bad in my list of things a president can do wrong. But I'd like to look more deeply at sort of as an economist looking at the effects of these kinds of acts that will have unintended consequences on future borrowers and also future those who set future tuitions. Putting on our economist hat now and say, okay, if this is water under the bridge and we can't do anything about it, perhaps we can. But if we can't, what is the effect on, let's say, that person about to consider going to school? Maybe they just pulled up drove to Boston for their first year of college. What is the likely effect on the borrower? And then let's talk about what's the likely effect on universities going forward.
Yeah, great point. I mean, I do a lot of call-in radio shows, and those callers are pretty angry about how this is unfair. And I say, yeah, but life's not fair, right? And so that's the least of my concern. My concern is going forward, what happens. And what I'm very afraid of is that we've sent the message to future students that when you borrow and take on federal student loans, this is not money that you're going to have to pay back. Now, can you imagine you're about to go out and buy a car, Joe, and you have just been given the message that, okay, you're going to take out a loan to pay for that car, but you're probably not going to have to pay it back. Do you think that changes the type of car you're going to be looking for?
Of course.
Okay, so my belief is that, and this is untested, right? We've never done anything like this. So we're sort of projecting, trying to imagine what's going to happen. My concern is that student now has that message that they don't need to pay back those loans. And they're thinking, hey, maybe I will go to that really expensive college. Maybe I will buy a car so that I can commute, a nicer car, maybe I'll, borrow, even though I have some money in the bank account, right? This additional willingness that students will have to spend is bad for them, because they might actually have to pay it back. We don't really know what's coming. But it's also bad because institutions, colleges and universities are going to respond to that by raising their prices. Now, people say, like, Beth, you're so cynical, right? People aren't bad. They're always going to try to do what's best. This is basic economics, right? This is, you give people more money, they're willing to spend more. Okay. Subsidies drive up willingness to spend. And then at the same time, when you have an increase in demand that comes from that willingness to spend, sellers, in this case, colleges and universities, increase the price. It's not controversial. I'm not saying that these are bad people or bad institutions for that happening, but I really believe that that's what's to come. And with, the run up in borrowing and the rampant tuition inflation being the really primary concerns about higher education finance in this country, it seems like we've just exacerbated both of those problems.
And indeed, if you know the money you're borrowing to go to school may not have to be repaid, as you say, you're willing to spend more, but you're also perhaps less inclined to scrutinize the value of that education. If you take on a lot of debt, you better bloody well know how to pay it back. If you don't have to pay it back, what difference does it make if you go to law school or you get a degree in puppetry? Really, it's a debt that is not your concern. I'm very concerned about that because some of our elite schools already don't charge tuition for beneath a particular income. I think it was Princeton announced just yesterday that families making less than $150,000 don't have to pay any tuition and they actually get a stipend.
Right.
But we're talking about those expensive schools who have, let's say, the value of their degree may not be what we hope.
Right.
So I want to, of course, give us time to say, okay, look, this is a big sort of Gordian knot mess of distortions in price and ability to pay and signals. We don't know if what we're spending on college is worth it. We don't know how to go about borrowing. We're not underwriting. You mentioned that. So I'm going to give you a chance because you study this all the time to say, okay, we'll say queen for the day or longer, and you were setting policy, and perhaps we will see a big change in control of Congress after the November election. What would you encourage those people who want to roll up their sleeves and not put ourselves in this situation where we have lots of kids who have debt and can't pay it back? What would you do to reform the system to make it, let's say, from an economist's perspective, more efficient?
Yeah, great. So there's one thing. I mean, there's lots of things, but I'm going to give you the one thing that I think is the most consequential. I think we need to stop making loans that we know are unaffordable. Right. So right now, like we said, there's no underwriting in federal student loan program. All institutions are eligible to give out student loans to the federal maximum, regardless of whether their last cohorts of students have been able to repay those loans that they took out. You've got to end that system.
So I want to ask, so you're saying there's schools that whose graduates reliably do not pay back their loans. In other words, they're charging for degrees, kids are graduating, and they're defaulting on a consistent basis. And there's a pattern. There's nothing to stop that right now.
Exactly right. And we've heard a lot about how for-profit institutions do that, right? I mean, people love to hate on any for-profit participation in education, but this is happening at public institutions. This is happening at private nonprofit institutions. Certain programs of study are reliably churning out people who can't afford to pay back their loans, and the loans end up getting paid off by taxpayers. That's got to stop. And right now, the gatekeeper for those loans and who determines, which institutions are able to participate is a process called accreditation. So there's these third-party organizations that say, yes, you look like a lovely college or lovely university. Go ahead, give federal student loans to your students. And the Department of Education relies on that stamp of approval to say which institutions can get loans and which institutions can use Pell Grants. I think we've got to get rid of that convoluted process and just look at the results. So if an institution has students taking out loans that are succeeding in paying them back, keep them in the program, keep allowing them to use taxpayer dollars because it's supporting good investments. If institutions are constantly having students default on their loans, cut them out of the program altogether. Now you could start to scale it back so that poor performance means lower loan limits for students, or you can get them out of the system entirely. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, but I think what it boils down to is just not making new loans that are unaffordable for students and end up getting picked up by taxpayers. It's not good for taxpayers, and it's also not good for the individuals, right? Yes, it's going to affect the eligibility for some or the accessibility for some students to get into college, right? Because they may not be able to take the loans to go to their local community college or their local private nonprofit institution. But those loans that they would have gotten were loans that were going to have them underwater for the next decade of their life anyway. Those aren't good loans. They're not loans that we want to make. So that's the one thing I would change. And I think that would have a lot of ripple effects that would, end up with a much better system of finance.
So you were kind of coming full circle, and with my question about, it may be the case that we almost clearly can accept that in many cases, a college degree is not worth what you paid for it. So by holding institutions accountable that don't deliver on the promise to, in a sense, improve someone's life, those are no longer available. But it will have, let's say, the unfortunate effect of excluding those people who need loans to go to school from getting that degree. But what you're saying is that degree wasn't doing them any favors. I guess the effect would be then to encourage schools to have either more useful majors or lower tuitions. Am I stating the obvious there?
Yeah, and either of those things are fine with me. And, unfortunately, I think fortunately or unfortunately, this might affect that puppetry program that you were talking about, for example. And I don't think we should do away with all arts programs, right? That would be a potential consequence of this. But I think we should subsidize them differently. So stop putting these unaffordable loans to students to pay for them, and say, if we socially value arts, we need to pay for it, right? We need to give grant money to institutions or give grant money to students who want to study in these programs. The idea of giving people unaffordable loans in order to sustain something with social value is just kind of a wacky idea.
Indeed. And also some of your proposals, you had an excellent article recently published in National Review talking about consolidating the debt process. So your first answer was about how to reform how we hold institutions accountable, but I think you also had written about streamlining the process for getting a loan, and in a sense having everybody go to one place and have some sort of standardized, less Byzantine process that, again, complexity is a subsidy for the rich and informed. The complexity also excludes those people who have less money, less time, less experience, parents who didn't go to college and don't understand the process. You had some good ideas along that. So share with our listeners what you had in mind there.
Yeah. People are often surprised to learn that there's already protections in place for borrowers who end up with unaffordable loans. And that's really sad. I mean, we are already forgiving loans that prove to be unaffordable, but the people who are taking advantage of that are people who go to expensive law schools and know how to navigate the system. So the reason that that's not known by everyone is because we don't have a streamlined system. There was never a point in time where policymakers decided, hey, let's make sure that, when people borrow to go to college, that if it's unaffordable, then they don't have to finish paying it back. And so instead, we've had these piecemeal policy changes. And over time, some incremental change through executive order, a little bit of legislative change here. And so we now have a universal program safety net so that everybody is eligible for that benefit, for that protection. But you got to jump through hoops to get it. So we've got to just do away with that. We need to pass legislation that just, puts in place a system that everybody's in the same boat. Automatically, they're going to pay back based on how much they're earning. And automatically, if that loan is unaffordable for them in the long run, then it gets forgiven. That way, these aren't benefits that are exclusively reserved for people who know how to navigate the system. And, it's also likely, I think, that if we have that working better, we'll stop having these calls to have these widespread, inefficient loan cancellation events, because people will recognize that we are helping the people who need it the most.
Indeed. I think those are excellent ideas, a sort of a streamlined way to get into college, and a more sort of transparent accountability for those colleges that they ultimately will borrow to go attend. I know our listeners have enjoyed our conversation and want to read more about your work. I mentioned your article in the National Review and also in the Globe, your opinion piece. Where can our listeners go to find your work on an ongoing basis to sort of help inform them on future policy choices?
Well, my day-to-day rants can be found on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Beth Akers, and all of my work is published at the American Enterprise Institute.
A great, fine institution. I read your work there as well. I really appreciate your time today, Beth. You've been a wonderful guest on the podcast. This hits home here in Boston. Every third person is going to school, so this affects everyone here. So we're very grateful for your research and your knowledge and the time today. Thank you for joining Hubwonk.
Thank you very much.
This has been another episode of Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are several ways to support the show. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. If you want to help make it easier for others to find Hubwonk, it would be great if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about topics for future Hubwonk episodes, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.